The story you are about to hear today does not begin in the halls of a grand palace, nor in the silent cloisters of an ancient monastery, but on the bustling streets of a small French town in the 19th century. Imagine a young woman with deep eyes and nimble hands walking across a stone bridge. The cold wind of Normandy brushes her face, but her heart is warmed by a great faith. Suddenly, she meets the gaze of a young watchmaker, noble and reserved in bearing. At that very moment, an inner voice, clear and unmistakable, whispers in her soul, "He is the one I have prepared for you." This providential encounter on the St. Leonard Bridge, in the town of Alencon, would forever change the history of the Catholic Church. The young woman was Marie Zélie Guérin, affectionately known as Zélie. The young man was Louis Martin. Together, they would form not just a family, but a true sanctuary of love and holiness. They would become the first married couple with children to be canonized together in the history of the Church, and they would give the world one of the greatest saints of modern times, Saint Thérèse of the Child Jesus. But the life of Saint Zélie Martin is much more than being the mother of a saint. She was an extraordinary woman in her own right, a successful businesswoman who ran a thriving lace-making enterprise, a devoted mother who knew the indescribable joy of giving birth to 9 children, and the heart-wrenching pain of bearing 4 of them in infancy. A passionate wife who lived a conjugal love so pure and profound that the Church recognized it as a perfect path to holiness. And finally, a woman of heroic faith who faced a terrible illness with absolute trust in divine providence. Prepare yourself to discover the fascinating life of Saint Zélie Martin, a story of love, tears, hard work, and unwavering trust in God. A story that teaches us that holiness is not a privilege reserved for monks and hermits, but a calling for all of us, amid pots and pans, business, and diapers. And stay tuned, for in the next episode of our channel, we will dive into the life of her beloved husband, Saint Louis Martin, completing the beautiful tapestry of this holy family. Marie Zélie Guérin was born on December 23, 1831, in the small village of Gondelain, in the Orne department of the Normandy region, France. She was the second of 3 children born to Isidore Guérin and Louise Jeanne Massy. Her father was a former soldier of the Imperial Army who had become a policeman, a man of strict discipline and deep faith. Her mother was a devout woman but of a severe temperament. Zélie's childhood was not marked by great displays of affection. Later in life, she would write in one of her letters that her childhood and youth were, quote, "as sad as a shroud," for her mother was very strict and rarely showed tenderness. Despite the rigidity of her family environment, or perhaps because of it, Zélie's faith blossomed in an extraordinary way. In September 1844, when Zélie was almost 13, the family moved to the town of Alencon. There, she and her older sister, Marie-Louise, were enrolled in a boarding school run by the Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Picpus. It was in this religious environment that Zélie's vocation began to take shape. She was a brilliant student, with a special talent for writing and a natural inclination toward prayer and contemplation. Her older sister, Marie-Louise, felt the call to religious life and entered the Visitation Convent in the city of Le Mans, taking the name Sister Marie d'Auxity. Inspired by her sister's example and moved by a deep love for God, Zélie also desired to consecrate her life entirely to the Lord. She felt a strong attraction to the charism of St. Vincent de Paul and decided to seek admission to the Daughters of Charity congregation with the desire to serve the poor and the sick. Full of hope, the young Zélie presented herself to the Mother Superior of the Daughters of Charity in Alencon. However, the response she received was a devastating blow. After speaking with her, the Mother Superior categorically declared that religious life was not God's will for her. The refusal was firm and left no room for appeal. For a young woman whose greatest dream was to be the bride of Christ, this rejection could have caused bitterness or rebellion. But Zélie's reaction reveals the depth of her soul and the maturity of her faith. Instead of despairing, Zélie humbly submitted to the decision, believing that the voice of the Superior was the voice of God. With serene sadness, she prayed a prayer that would define the rest of her life. "My God, since I am not worthy to be your spouse, I will enter the state of marriage to fulfill your holy will. Therefore, I beg you to give me many children and that they all be consecrated to you." This prophetic prayer not only accepted a new path, but elevated it to a sacred mission. Zélie understood that marriage was not a consolation prize for those who could not become nuns, but a divine vocation as sublime as consecrated life. With the convent door closed, Zélie needed to find a way to support herself and help her family. On December 8, 1851, the feast of the Immaculate Conception, she was praying when she received a very clear inner inspiration. Make Alencon lace. Alencon lace was famous throughout Europe, known as the Queen of Laces. It was an extremely delicate handcraft made with needle and fine thread, requiring infinite patience and exceptional skill. Zélie enrolled in a lace school and quickly demonstrated prodigious talent. She not only mastered the technique perfectly, but also revealed a remarkable entrepreneurial spirit. By the end of 1853, at just 22 years old, she opened her own lace-making workshop. Zélie did not work alone. She designed the patterns, prepared the work, and distributed it to various lace makers who worked from their own homes. Then she collected the pieces, assembled the final product, and sold them to major stores in Paris. The business prospered rapidly. Zélie became a successful businesswoman, respected for her honesty, the impeccable quality of her work, and the fair and charitable way she treated her employees. She paid fair wages, cared for the well-being of the families of her lace makers, and often helped them in times of need. At a time when women rarely managed their own businesses, Zélie Martin stood out as a pioneer, proving that it is possible to combine professional success with an authentic and charitable Christian life. Despite her professional success, Zélie's heart still longed to fulfill the vocation she had embraced in her prayer, marriage, and motherhood. The years passed, and she remained single, dedicating herself to work and prayer. Then came the providential meeting on the St. Leonard Bridge in April 1858. Louis Martin was a 34-year-old watchmaker and jeweler who had also tried religious life. He had sought to enter the monastery of the Great Saint Bernard in the Swiss Alps, but was rejected because he did not know Latin. Like Zélie, he accepted the refusal as God's will and returned to Alencon, where he opened his watchmaking shop. Louis was known in town for his deep piety, unquestionable honesty, and reserved character. His friends often said Louis is a saint. When Zélie crossed paths with him on the bridge and heard the inner voice saying, "He is the one I have prepared for you," she immediately knew her search was over. Louis was also deeply impressed by the young lacemaker. The mutual recognition of their souls was so swift and profound that their engagement lasted only 3 months. On July 13, 1858, at midnight, as was customary at the time, Louis and Zélie were united in the sacrament of marriage at the Church of Our Lady in Alencon. The beginning of the Martins, marriage was marked by an unusual decision. Inspired by the example of Saint Joseph and the Virgin Mary, and moved by a deep desire for spiritual purity, Louis and Zélie decided to live as brother and sister, in total continence. For 10 months, they shared the same house, the same life, but maintained celibacy. This period allowed them to forge an intense spiritual communion, uniting their souls before uniting their bodies. However, the confessor of both, perceiving the holiness of the couple and reminding them of the purpose of Christian marriage, intervened. He advised them to abandon this sacred experience and to open themselves to the gift of life, reminding Zélie of her own prayer asking for many children to consecrate to God. The couple promptly obeyed. Zélie would later write to her daughter Pauline, "As for me, I wish to have many children so that I could raise them for heaven." From that moment on, the Martin household became a true nursery of souls. In less than 13 years, Zélie gave birth to 9 children, 7 girls and 2 boys. The first, Marie, was born in 1860. She was followed by Pauline, Léonie, Aline, the boys Joseph Louis and Joseph Jean-Baptiste, Céline, Mélanie Thérèse, and finally the youngest, Thérèse, born on January 2, 1873. Zélie was a passionate mother. In one of her letters, she expressed the joy of motherhood. "We lived only for our children. They were all our happiness, which we found only through them." The Martin home was full of life, laughter, and playfulness, but also of loving discipline and a deep life of prayer. Zélie and Louis taught their children to offer their hearts to God from a very young age, to accept the small daily annoyances, to please Jesus, and to love the poor. Yet the joy of the Martin family was repeatedly tested by the crucible of suffering. Infant mortality was high in the 19th century, and the family was not spared. Of the 9 children, 4 died in early childhood. The two boys, Joseph Louis and Joseph Jean-Baptiste, died before reaching 1 year old. Little Melanie Thérèse lived only 2 months, but the most painful loss was that of Helene, who died suddenly at 5.5 years old. Zélie's pain at the death of her children was immense, a true sword piercing her mother's heart. In her letters, she did not hide her heartbreaking suffering. When Helene died, she wrote, "I did not expect this sudden blow, nor did my husband. When he arrived and saw his poor little daughter dead, he began to sob, crying out, 'My little Helene! My little Helene! We offered it to God together.'" Despite the indescribable pain, Zélie's faith never wavered. She found comfort in the absolute certainty that her children were in heaven, interceding for the family. She wrote to a sister-in-law who had lost a baby, "When I closed the eyes of my dear little children and buried them, I felt immense pain, but I always resigned myself. I do not regret the pains and care I had for them. People tell me it would have been better never to have had them. I cannot bear that language. My children were not lost forever. Life is short and full of misery, and we will find them up there." This supernatural vision of motherhood and suffering is one of the most striking traits of Zélie's holiness. She was not a woman insensitive to pain, but a woman who allowed pain to be illuminated by the hope of eternal life. She understood that her womb had borne citizens for heaven, and this certainty gave her the strength to continue loving and educating the daughters who had survived. As the family grew and faced its trials, Zélie's lace-making business continued to prosper. The demand was so great that, in 1870, Louis made a remarkable decision. He sold his watchmaking shop to dedicate himself fully to helping his wife manage the lace workshop. He took on the accounting, business trips to Paris to negotiate with major suppliers, and order management. This professional partnership between husband and wife was rare at the time and demonstrates the deep unity and mutual respect that existed between Louis and Zélie. They formed a perfect team, both in family life and in business. The financial prosperity they achieved never distanced them from God. On the contrary, they used their resources to help those in need. The Martin home was known in Alençon as a refuge for the poor. Zélie often invited beggars to eat at her table, cared for abandoned sick people, and helped young people in difficulty find work. The family's spiritual life was intense and structured. Louis and Zélie attended daily mass at 5:30 in the morning before starting their workday. Sunday rest was strictly observed. Louis never opened the shop on Sundays, dedicating the entire day to God, family, and rest. Evenings were spent together as a family, with spiritual readings, games, and communal prayers. It was in this environment of living faith, incarnated in daily life, that little Thérèse and her sisters absorbed the principles that would lead them to religious life. However, a dark shadow began to hang over the Martin family. In 1865, Zélie had noticed a small lump in her right breast. At first, she did not give it much importance, but over the years, the lump grew and began to cause terrible pain. Doctors diagnosed a fibrous tumor, which we now know was breast cancer. At that time, treatments were limited and ineffective, and the disease progressed inexorably. For 12 years, Zélie lived with the illness, silently enduring increasingly sharp pain so as not to worry the family. She continued to work, care for her daughters, and manage the household with heroic willpower. Only in her letters to her sister, the nun Marie d'Ossete, and to her brother Isidore did she reveal the extent of her suffering. By the end of 1876, the disease had reached an advanced stage. The tumor had spread, and the pain became constant and excruciating. Zélie knew her time on earth was drawing to a close. Her greatest anguish was not the physical pain or fear of death, but concern for the future of her daughters, especially little Thérèse, who was only 4 years old, and Léonie, who was a difficult child and needed special care. In a last effort to seek healing, moved by hope and the insistence of her family, Zélie undertook an exhausting pilgrimage to the sanctuary of Our Lady of Lourdes in June 1877. She traveled with her 3 eldest daughters, Marie, Pauline, and Léonie. The train journey was a physical torment for the sick woman, but she endured it all with faith. At Lourdes, she immersed herself in the icy waters of the grotto, praying fervently for a miracle. But the miracle of physical healing did not happen. Zélie returned to Alencon knowing that God's will was otherwise. Her acceptance of this will is a moving testimony of abandonment into the Father's hands. She wrote to her daughter Pauline, "If the good God wants to heal me, I will be very happy, because deep down I want to live. It pains me to leave my husband and my children. But on the other hand, I tell myself, if I do not get better, it is perhaps because it is more useful for them that I depart." Zélie's last months of life were a true Calvary. She was bedridden, consumed by pain and weakness. Louis cared for her with infinite tenderness, never leaving her side. The older daughters took on the household tasks. Little Thérèse, sensing the gravity of the situation, covered her mother with kisses and affection. On the 28th of August, 1877, at midnight, surrounded by the love of her husband and her brother Isidore, Marie Zélie Martin gave her beautiful soul to God. She was 45 years old. Her last words were a whisper of faith and hope. Little Thérèse, remembering that sad moment, would later write, "From Mama, I loved her smile. Her deep gaze seemed to say, 'Eternity delights and draws me. I am going to the blue heaven to see God.'" Zélie's death was a devastating blow to Louis and the girls. At 54 years old, Louis found himself a widower with 5 daughters to raise. Fulfilling Zélie's wish, he made the difficult decision to leave Alencon, the city where they had built their life in love, and moved to Lisieux to be near his brother-in-law, Isidore Guérin, who could help with the girls' education. In Lisieux, the seed of holiness planted by Zélie would continue to grow, leading all 5 of her daughters to consecrate their lives to God in religious life. The holiness of Zélie and Louis Martin did not go unnoticed by the Church. They did not perform great public deeds, did not found religious orders, nor did they suffer martyrdom by blood. Their holiness was forged in the everyday life of family, in conjugal love, honest work, the education of their children, and the serene acceptance of suffering. They lived what Pope John Paul II would later call the eminent holiness of the institution of conjugal love. The canonization process for the couple began in 1946. In 1994, Pope John Paul II declared them both venerable, recognizing their heroic virtues. But for them to be beatified and canonized, the Church required proof of miracles obtained through their intercession. And the miracles that confirm the holiness of this couple are as beautiful and familiar as the life they lived. The miracle that led to the beatification of Louis and Zélie took place in Italy in 2002. On May 25th of that year, in the city of Monza near Milan, a boy named Pietro Sciliro was born. The joy of his birth soon turned to despair. Pietro was born with a severe pulmonary malformation, a fatal condition. The doctors at St. Gerard Hospital informed his parents, Walter and Adele, that there was no hope for survival. The baby was placed on maximum respiratory support, fighting for every breath. Faced with imminent death, the parents decided to baptize little Pietro on June 3rd. That same day, a family friend, Carmelite Father Antonio Sangalli, visited the hospital. He brought with him an image of Louis and Zélie Martin and suggested the parents ask for the couple's intercession. "We knew Saint Thérèse," Pietro's mother recalled, "but we knew very little about her parents. Father Antonio explained to us that Thérèse's parents had lost 4 children in infancy. That touched us deeply. They knew exactly what we were going through." The Sciliro family began a novena to Louis and Zélie. The prayer network spread quickly. Friends, relatives, parishioners, and even people from other countries joined in prayer, asking Saint Thérèse's parents to save little Pietro. On June 5th, a biopsy confirmed the fatal prognosis. The situation seemed irreversible, but the family did not give up. On June 13th, they began a second novena. And then the inexplicable happened. On June 29th, a nurse noticed a sudden and surprising improvement in the baby's condition. Pietro no longer needed 100% oxygen. His lungs, which had been severely damaged, began to function normally. Within days, he was breathing without any assistance. On July 27th, Pietro was discharged from the hospital, in perfect health, without any lasting effects. The doctors were astonished. The official medical report stated, quote, "Given the complexity of the case and the clinical evolution, we consider the cure an inexplicable surprise." The Church rigorously investigated the case, and on July 3, 2008, Pope Benedict XVI officially recognized Pietro Scaliro as cure, as a miracle attributed to the intercession of Louis and Zélie Martin. On October 19, 2008, the couple was beatified in an emotional ceremony in Lisieux, with little Pietro, then 6 years old, in attendance. But the story did not end there. For canonization, a second miracle was required, and once again, the intercession of the Martins saved a child's life. The canonization miracle occurred in Spain, in the city of Valencia, in 2008. A girl named Carmen Perez Pons was born prematurely at just 6 months gestation and suffered multiple severe complications, including a severe brain hemorrhage. The doctors prepared her parents for the worst, stating that even if she survived, she would have permanent and severe brain damage. Carmen's father, desperate, went to the Discalced Carmelite monastery in the city of Serra to ask for prayers. The nuns, knowing the story of the newly beatified Louis and Zélie Martin, suggested the family ask for the couple's intercession. Once again, a prayer network formed. And once again, the Martins answered from heaven. Carmen experienced a sudden, complete, and medically inexplicable recovery. She not only survived, but grew into a perfectly healthy child, without any trace of brain damage. After a thorough medical and theological investigation, Pope Francis approved the decree recognizing the miracle on March 18, 2015. And so, on October 18, 2015, during the Synod of Bishops on the Family, Pope Francis solemnly canonized St. Louis and Saint Zélie Martin in St. Peter's Square, Rome. It was a historic moment, the first time a married couple was canonized together in the same ceremony. The life of Saint Zélie Martin is a shining beacon for our time. She shows us that holiness does not require withdrawing from the world, but living in the world with our hearts turned toward heaven. She sanctified herself through her profession, her marriage, the joy of watching her children grow, and the indescribable pain of losing them. She transformed the lace of Alencon into a continuous prayer and made her home a true temple of the Holy Spirit. May the example of Saint Zélie inspire us to seek holiness in the small things of daily life, to trust in divine providence even in the darkest hours, and to make our families true schools of love and faith. And don't forget, the story of this extraordinary family continues. In the next episode, we will learn about the life of Saint Louis Martin, the watchmaker who became a saint, the loving father who, together with Zélie, prepared the ground for the little flower Saint Thérèse, to blossom and perfume the whole world. May Saint Zélie Martin intercede for all of us and for our families. Until then,